In this episode I'm going to have a look at how knitting evolved from the medieval guild halls to the trenches of world wars, and how it transitioned into the domestic art we know today. In medieval Europe, knitting was a male-dominated profession. Domestic knitters would make clothing out of necessity, but to trade in knitted goods in any European city you had to be a member of a guild. Knitting guilds, especially in places like France and Germany, maintained strict training and apprenticeship systems. Knitting guild members were highly skilled craftsmen, creating fine stockings, gloves and religious ceremonial garments for the elite and the clergy. Becoming a master knitter took years of training, and guilds guarded their techniques closely. It's difficult to pin down exactly when the guilds first started, but there are mentions of English hosiers in 1320 that produced knitted gaiters. The first mention of a knitting guild in Paris is in 1268. Later guilds appear in the Netherlands in 1429 and Barcelona in 1496. This increase in knitting guild numbers shows the increasing demand for knitted garments during this time, primarily for knitted stockings and berets, which they tended to prefer over the traditional caps. Normandy primarily traded with Jersey and Guernsey for their knit garments. In 1663, 240,000 pairs of stockings are recorded to be imported from these two islands alone. In 1589, a clergyman named William Lee invented his knitting frame. A funny story about how William Lee came up with the knitting machine. There was a girl that he was interested in courting, and she wasn't interested, so to ignore him, she busied herself with her knitting. She did this so much that he became bitter and decided to make a device that would knit so that it would render her unemployed so that she'd have to pay attention to him. He learned the needle movements by watching her hands and got so engrossed by this, he forgot all his other pursuits, including his romantic interest in her, and his day job, claiming that his invention will give him great fortune. He had backings from investors and presented the idea to the Queen. Queen Elizabeth I said, "Consider thou what the invention would do to my poor subjects. It would assuredly bring them to ruin by depriving them of employment." She was also unimpressed that it couldn't knit silk, only wool, so it didn't appeal to her fine taste. So she did not grant him his patent. He had to then go and perfect his machine. This took another 8 years, but it was now able to knit silk to make fine stockings, increasing his number of needles per inch from 8 to 20. The patent was once again refused by the Queen for the same reason, of depriving the guild knitters of their primary trade. He ended up moving to France and gaining favour with the King there, where he was granted his patent eventually in 1600 by Henry IV, and he signed contracts to supply knitting machines all over the country. It didn't go overly well for him though, because the king was assassinated in 1610, and then he lost his royal protection. He was a Protestant and a foreigner in France, and he died penniless in Paris in 1614, so wasn't the best ending for poor him. Lee's brother James managed to get back to Britain with his machine and started using them to produce stockings. These were sold and gained the interest of the gentry in London. In 1663, the Worshipful Company of Framework Knitters was given a royal charter. It continued to this day. An effect the knitting machine had was the demand for hand-knit stockings went down. As the Queen had feared, this affected the guilds, and those who didn't adopt the new machines suffered. The machine-knit pieces were better in quality, and more could be made in a shorter amount of time. This had an interesting effect on the lace-making industry, though, where demand increased for intricate lace pieces. This was an industry dominated by women, and it wasn't possible for it to be replicated by machine at the time. The prices stayed relatively low, though, for these lace pieces. As no guilds or special laws were passed to restrict the craft, knowledge was shared freely, and the only limit was in the motivation and dexterity of the person doing it. Good old women, eh? The Industrial Revolution, it transformed knitting. Rather than having to sit at a spinning wheel, raw material could be sent to mills for spinning on a mass scale. This is what followed after such inventions in the late 1700s, like the spinning jenny, allowing one person to spin multiple threads at a time. And Arkwright's water-frame spinning machine, powered by water, it could spin hundreds of threads at once. And of course, Watt's steam engine in 1776, meaning factories no longer had to be built next to a water source like a river for power. They could be anywhere you could install the engine. This could power large powered spinning looms, increasing production exponentially. The effects these had were both fantastic and tragic. High production volumes meant yarn could be spun, woven, knitted around the clock. But there was the very problem. The people working these machines were normally women and children. These were the cheapest source of labour, but the jobs carried very high risk. With 12-hour workdays in dark and cramped conditions, and little in the way of health and safety, injuries and even fatalities were common. The main textiles in the UK were wool and flax, but with increased trade with the Americas, cotton could also now be used. The cotton, which was picked by enslaved people on the plantations, just to put that in there, but I won't go too deep into that one, was imported from the US to Britain. This was then processed in the British factories by workers in brutal conditions. The fabric and garments were then shipped all over Europe. By the early 1800s, the workers had had enough, with protests all around Britain by workers wanting a fair wage and safer conditions. Some of these protests involved breaking the machinery that they used to do their work. This led to legislation being passed to make the destruction of textile machinery a capital offence. 60 people were hanged due to relating offences. It wasn't all bad though. Some mill workers saw the value in having a happy workforce and, not treating people like slaves. One mill owner called Robert Owens set to reform his mill by limiting working hours. He opened a school, he provided social housing, and he ended the physical punishment for the workers. He still employed children, but at least they weren't being beaten now, eh? This proved a success, and in the 60 years he ran the mill, he saw it become the largest in Scotland, and some of the working conditions he implemented became law in the Factory Act of 1819. Today his mill, New Lanark, is a National Heritage Site. 1914 and the dawn of war brought new challenges, with troops being assembled and needing full uniforms, including a greatcoat, trousers, tunic, flannel shirts, vest, underpants, and 3 pairs of socks. The socks also required replacing every 3 months. With the conditions these men were being sent to, a dry pair of socks was an essential need. Those who could knit were encouraged to send parcels with socks as donations. This sparked knitting clubs to be set up in every village and town. People were knitting everywhere, in the shops, theatre, and between courses at restaurants. Children were taught to knit, and even wounded soldiers would wind wool into balls whilst recovering from their injuries in their hospital beds. Not just socks though, balaclavas, mittens, and special rifleman's gloves, which was a mitten with 2 fingers, so the wearer could pull a trigger whilst wearing them. The yarn used was a 4-ply spun wool and cotton, with the wool coming from New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. In Washington, a flock of 48 sheep were kept within the grounds of the White House to both maintain the lawn and provide wool to be sold at auction. This raised over $50,000 for the Red Cross at the time. The predominant colours used were grey, brown, and of course khaki green. Knitting kits of steel and wooden double-pointed needles and a knitting bag were sold in enormous numbers to keep up with demand and standardise the materials used for production. In the USA alone, its estimated knitters dedicated 2 million hours of labour in the 18 months the US was in the war, and used over 20,000 tonnes of wool. They also made 22 million garments. These pieces were more than just clothes to keep warm and comfortable. They were sentimental to the soldiers on the front lines, showing that communities at home cared for them and helped to raise their spirits. Many knitters wrote notes and put them in the pieces so that it was to cheer the soldiers on when they were on the front lines. This spirit continued into the Second World War, with hundreds of knitted patterns being distributed, and nations once again doing their bit for the war effort. There are also reports of knitting being used as a spy technique. Phyllis Latour Doyle, who was a British secret agent, was deployed to occupied Normandy in 1944. She would chat with German soldiers and learn information. She would then get out her knitting kit and knit Morse code into garments for British secret intelligence to decode. Both wars caused a shortage of wool and cotton yarns, with old pieces being unpicked and reworked for years after, while the world recovered. After the wars and the sophistication of industrial knitting machines, clothing could now be mass-produced, and there was no longer as much of a need to learn to knit. Being the sign of a well-bred woman in the Victorian era, it was starting to be considered a dowdy and pastime elderly for women. During the 70s and 80s, knitted goods could be so cheaply made through mass production that many didn't see the need to knit at all, and the adoption of the skill took a downturn. It's also worth mentioning here that even though knitting machines can produce sections of knitted garments, to this day they can't really seam or finish clothing. That still needs to be done by human hands. Human hands that are normally working in slightly questionable circumstances and for a very small wage. And of course, there's still no machine that can crochet. So if you see something advertised as crochet for a questionably low cost, just have a think. There have been some knit pieces made to look like crochet, so it might be made by machine, but genuine crochet is always done 100% by people's hands, so think about the labour costs involved in that. Knitting now is more of a fine craft or a hobby. People making things for family and friends or to keep up regional traditions, and some using it as a resistance to fast fashion and promotion of anti-consumerism. While it's still seen as a women's craft, many men also knit as well, and it's starting to be seen as a gender-neutral pastime. Hand knitting takes time, skill and patience, skills passed down both through family, and in the modern age you can do this via YouTube, blogs, Instagram, insert social media site of choice here. Skills can be shared so widely among larger communities, both in person and online, that the possibilities are endless. Home knitters today can also use a range of hand skills and also use smaller versions of knitting machines to produce pieces by mixing the new and the manual techniques. I'm going to put a video in here of, I recommend it, it's a man and he's using like a circular knitting machine and he's put a motor on it, that seems quite reasonable, but then he's managed to program it so that it can do colour work as well, and it's a fascinating one. I do recommend it. Knitting has always adapted to the times, from medieval guild halls to wartime trenches to living room couches. It's been a livelihood, a lifeline and a form of legacy. Thanks for watching. I hope you're enjoying these little snippets. I hope to make them a bit longer in future and maybe dive a bit deeper into some of the bits I mentioned, but yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.